Hello everybody, I am joined by Grandmaster Peter Heine Nielsen. He was Danish champion 5 times. He played in 7 Olympiads for Denmark. More recently, he's worked as a trainer, working for Magnus and Viswanathan Anand. And Peter, I believe, is it correct that you are undefeated in World Championship matches?
Yeah, as a coach, yeah, that's true, actually, yes.
Also undefeated as a player, but that may be less impressive.
Yeah.
Even more recently, Peter is running for FIDE deputy president, along with his running mate, Grandmaster Andrei Barish-Politz. So he's very nicely offered some of his time to talk about some issues connected to FIDE and I guess we'll get started with that. Peter, how did you decide to run? What gave you the idea to get involved?
Andrei asked me to run with him as his vice, sort of the deputy for FIDE. I mean, well, Andrei announced sometime earlier that he was going to run sort of for presidency, and at some point he asked me, and I thought about it for a while and had some talks with him. I decided, okay, I will join him. I mean, it's no secret that I have been despaired about FIDE for, well, longer than even sort of this administration, actually quite longer than that, but also that I think that things has been going in a direction that I find unfortunate, and of course especially in the sort of recent months due to the sort of events in Ukraine. But so it's a recent decision that I actually decided to become active in chess for 6 years.
So the big news in chess recently has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I think it's fair to say that throughout its history, FIDE has been more closely connected to Russia than any other country. During the current administration's reign of FIDE, 11 of 20 major tournaments were held in Russia. I looked up the 2021 World Cup sponsors page. There's 8 of them, 7 of them are Russian corporations. How do you think the current administration, what responsibility do they have for that? Or is it fair to say that they have followed sanctions and cut them all off when the invasion happened, and what happened before that doesn't matter? How do you feel about that argument?
Well, I think for a start we should try and judge things on the 4-year period and not only the last 3 months. And it's clear that FIDE has chosen to be incredibly linked, and one would say Russian, but I will almost say Kremlin in a way. I mean, many of the sponsorships has been, for instance, by state companies or some very Kremlin companies like, for instance, Simmerland, who is known for their sort of famous flash mob videos praising Putin and such. And that also at many chess events we have seen oligarchs as VIPs and such. And well, it's clear that I think chess and FIDE especially is maybe the sport ever who's been closest linked to a government and in this case the Russian government. And that is clear. I have against that, and I think many has, and we are sort of trying to change that. Of course, due to the sanctions and such, there has been a change. So a lot of the FIDE sponsors has left, but well, for instance, we will be afraid that they might appear again, and we think that it's important to completely cut the ties to Russia and especially the Kremlin, not just by removing the sponsors of the sanctions, but also getting rid of the actual sort of personal ties and start afresh. And I think that, well, chess has been connected to Soviet Union and Russia via FIDE for I think about 44 years now, and it's about high time to stop.
So in addition to FIDE's connection to Russian organizations, there's also the connection to individual players. And as I understand the policy right now, Russian chess players are required to cut ties and to formally change their nationality, their FIDE nationality, to play in tournaments. How do you think FIDE has handled the connection with Russian players, and is there anything that you would do differently as far as letting them play in tournaments?
Well, two things. I think FIDE is generally on the milder side. If you look at the whole spectrum, that based on the IOC recommendations, such, I think FIDE is generally taking the minimum requirements that is possible. But my focus is not so much how to deal with the players. It's more, I think, the political ties that are very important for us. And I think that in most sports federations, it's clear that, well, the main problem is the players, because the leadership is not connected to Russia. Chess is very special in that sense, that we actually have, a former Kremlin high-ranked politician leading the federation, and they can see that events and sponsors are from Russia in that sense. So I think our situation is quite special. But of course, dealing with the players is a difficult issue as well.
If everybody can hear in the background, there's a bit of a storm where we are, but the sound's still coming through, so we'll just keep going. It'll be all right. Recently, the Dvorkovich, the president of FIDE, has been taking, and other FIDE officials have been taking some trips around the world. They apparently have been to Bogota, Colombia. They've been to Montenegro, probably some other places that I was unable to confirm. The problem would be that FIDE rules prohibit using FIDE resources for a campaign. And Peter, you've been very vocal about criticizing this on Twitter. So what do you think about these trips?
Well, I mean, the rules are pretty clear that there is a 3 months electoral period, and then the idea is that every candidate, be it the actual president or his competition, should have equal terms. And that means that, well, you cannot use FIDE funds for traveling, you cannot use employees that are not on your ticket to help you and such. Well, their argument is that we are just doing our work traveling around the world. My counter argument is that, well, 4 years ago, you did exactly the same. You called it just a campaign instead. I mean, just more than 4 years ago, before the previous elections, the same two persons, Dvorkovich and Bologan, was traveling to South America. Bologan was giving symbols, Dvorkovich was talking with the delegates and ministers and such. And I think also, for instance, well, there's articles explaining that Bologan, who is with Dvorkovich now, was explaining to delegates that Dvorkovich will bring in 3 million euros, and that it will be spread to 150 countries via the sort of development funds, and he specified that will mean an average of 20,000 for each country and such. So it's the exact same team who went on a campaign to South America, who is doing exactly what they did 4 years ago. Now they're just saying it has nothing to do with campaign. It basically becomes absurd in that way, and especially when we have FIDE, who's actually made quite some effort of having a new charter with very specified electoral rules. If you then sort of don't give any attention to the rules or care about them at all, it becomes, well, you're trying to portray you have a kind of democracy and you have rules, but you're not following them at all. I mean, and well, basically it would be like that, well, for instance, cheating with phones in chess. We actually, just the very idea that you have a phone with you is enough for us to do something, because it's difficult to prove. And I think it's the same here. There is rules, they should be followed, and you cannot start arguing that, well, maybe we didn't talk with the delegates or something like that. It's pretty obvious they did, and I think, well, it's not just that I think it's a shame, I think it's a blatant breach of rules, and they shouldn't do so, but it's very difficult to do something about it.
So one of the points of contention between yourself and the current FIDE leadership has been about transparency. Mm-hmm. And specifically on the topic of sponsor transparency, it seems clear that it's FIDE's position that they will not always be totally transparent about the agreements they make with sponsors, about the details, and that is well and good and correct. Let me read you a quote here. This is David Yada, who is the FIDE Chief Marketing and Communication Officer. He says, "More often than not, sponsors demand that most details of the agreement are not disclosed," and then he gives an example of a Adidas World Cup sponsorship. "I am all for transparency, but when it comes to sponsorship, if we didn't accept this condition, our options would be greatly reduced in the range of 90%. Peter, do you accept that argument? Is that how you would also handle it?
I accept it to some extent, that we doesn't necessarily have to go into every kind of details, but I mean, before elections, Dvorkovich's election promise was, number one, was general transparency. There was also quotes saying that, well, sponsorship contracts has to be put forward and such. I mean, we don't even know the amounts at times. But my fight with transparency is more of a general thing, that it's very difficult to find out actually what happens on the board meetings and such. as I said, Dvorkovich ran on transparency, but one of the first decisions was to make a non-disclosure agreement for sort of some of the important layers of leadership. And well, it's more or less against, like with the electoral rules, we try to create this image of that things are actually functioning on a very democratic level, but if you start paying attention to it, it's actually very low. And well, for instance, also with the early administration, you could see which kind of financial interest member of the presidential board had, while this was more or less removed immediately for this administration and such. So, in my opinion, it's a lot of talk, but one should judge them by the actions, and the actions will actually be a reversal instead of progress.
So in addition to transparency with sponsors, there's also transparency about the financial entanglements of officials themselves. One of the other tickets in the FIDE election features Bakar Kuatli, who got into some trouble not too long ago by, it was discovered that there were connections between him and a company that was awarded a contract from the French Chess Federation, of which he was the president at the time. That sort of thing has some history of happening in chess, of awarding contracts to the people who are also, doing the awarding. What do you think FIDE can do to fight against that, or what can be the precautions taken?
Well, I think that they can start taking it serious, for instance. I mean, this thing you mentioned with Bahar Kuratli, who is the actual deputy president at the moment. I think it was from 2019, if I don't remember correctly. And, well, FIDE officials were saying we would look into it and such, but absolutely nothing has happened as far as I understand. Another example was with Bologan. I mean, only a few details can be seen about the situation with him in the verification committee, but basically the verification committee is mentioning that 120,000 euros that should have been transferred to FIDE was transferred to Bologan in some sponsorship deal. I am not able to understand the details there because there's no transparency about it, but it becomes also that it's impossible for us to prove things as there is no kind of proof in that sense. What should be done about it? Well, Nigel Short suggested a rather radical solution before the previous elections, that there should actually be transparency about presidential boards, or now maybe council boards members' financial interests, not just in terms of chess, but in general. This is how it's done in politics, for instance. For instance, myself, I'm married to a Lithuanian head of state. I have to declare any kind of financial interest I have, well, where I work, which kind of salary I have, which kind of stocks, etc., and so on, all my kind of interest. It's quite normal when people have power over a lot of people, they have responsibilities, then they also have to actually say, well, we have this kind of financial interest and such. If FIDE should go to that extreme, I don't know. But I think things should be much more transparent now. We had many cases in history where there always is suspicions about who actually owns what, etc. and such. I mean, quite often tournaments has been outsourced to companies that we don't know who actually is the actual ownership and so on and so forth. So I think it's very important that there is clarity about these things of those who are elected and in charge of FIDE, no doubt about that.
So tomorrow we have the candidates starting, and as I recall, Magnus has been very, well, I wouldn't say very, has been somewhat critical of the specifics of the World Championship format in the past. What do you think of the format, and would it change somewhat under your leadership in FIDE?
I think we generally think that it's a success of recently, that the candidates tournament, and before that even when it was World Championship tournaments in 2005 and 2007 was very successful and very popular. So I think a change of that is not really in the cards. Neither is it with a World Championship match. It is also something that has worked well, and we have a very long history of that. So I don't think that this is sort of the first thing that is in line to do something of change, because it's very popular. Of course, you could argue that should Magnus stop playing and sort of giving away his title, maybe it would be a good time to think of some kind of structural change. But I think in general, the current way it's done is seen as very, very popular and very, very successful. Recent candidates tournament has been thrillers. Let's see how it develops this time. Hopefully it will be interesting. So I think changes there is not at all a priority, even if Magnus is perhaps not happy about them.
So in addition to the World Championship format, there's been much discussion about how candidate spots are awarded. And there was recently a deal announced where the Grand Chess Tour would be awarding one spot. There was much controversy with the spot that Timur Rajabov now occupies. How would you change how candidate spots are awarded?
How to do it specifically, I cannot sort of say here. For instance, when you mentioned about the Grand Chess Tour, I think there is problems in the sense that, well, it's a private tournament. It's a bit unclear. Can they elect the players themselves? Are there going to be qualification and such? But, well, also it happened basically in the dark. No one knew that this deal was about to happen, and suddenly it was published. So there was no open debate about it in that sense. I think it's important that people have to qualify in a sporting way, but also in a sporting way where if you're the best player, you have quite a reasonable chance of qualifying as such. I think, well, there is numerous events which have had too much of a random element in it. One thing I also quite dislike is that it's tournaments like the Grand Swiss or earlier it's called Isle of Man, and now the Grand Chess Tour, who is taking over the qualification spots, because both the Grand Chess Tour and the Isle of Man was great tournaments we already had at that point, and then we used to have qualification and candidates on top of that. If they are now disappearing or actually merging, the reality is that chess is going to have less tournaments instead of what we used to have, and I think part of the problem is that FIDE has been lacking the ability to find sponsors, so rather they would actually find existing tournaments and make them into theirs. And that, I think, is the wrong. FIDE should create their own new tournaments. They should not take over the existing ones. I think that is a strategic mistake, which just means less chess.
So there's one more question that I have to ask. I already know what your answer is going to be, and I just sort of have to ask out of journalistic responsibility. Do you think Magnus is going to play a match for the World Championship against the winner of the candidates tournament that starts tomorrow?
Well, what does mean? I mean, if I mean it's less than 50%, then yes, I think it's less than 50%. But, well, I don't think Magnus knows, so how on earth would I know in that sense? But I think, well, a lot is kind of trying to fish for information. They will ask me, or they will push Magnus to ask. I think the reality is he doesn't know, and that generally when he has been giving interview, he is extremely honest. He actually tells what he thinks, and his position has been that at present he doesn't think so. He thinks it's quite likely that when it's crunch time, he also doesn't think so, but how can you know what you will feel and think in the future in a way? So I think Magnus is just trying to be very honest, and well, we have to keep it light, transparent about how he thinks about it and such. And yeah, I would like to help you. Well, it's important for the chess ball. What do you think for his second, who actually have to prepare the match? I would also like to know. But yeah, I can't really help you with that one.
Yeah, I imagine if I was going to get an answer about that out of you, probably somebody else would have gotten it out of you before.
Possibly, yeah.
All right. Well, we're running out of time here. Peter, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you for speaking with us, and good luck in the election.
Thanks a lot.